Tonight's event is a real highlight of our fall program. Why do I say highlight? There are many, many good reasons. The Center for Global Affairs is committing to hosting public conversations that challenge assumptions and provoke thought. I know that those of you who are with us tonight agree that tonight's topic, coming as it does one day before the first presidential debate and many months after a long campaign, realize that this is a very, very important topic. As this important topic deserves, we have assembled a panel of distinguished individuals who represent a variety of views and opinions, providing context for the lively discussion that I'm sure will ensue. Led by Arthur Miller, whom will be introduced later. Jim Hoge will provide the context for the discussion. Jim, as many of you know, he's known as, his real name is James F. Hoge, but his friends always refer to him as Jim, has a long and stellar career in foreign affairs and in media. He was editor of Foreign Affairs magazine for 18 years and is currently counselor, executive office of the Council on Foreign Relations and chair of Human Rights Watch. Before that, he was initially Washington correspondent, subsequently editor, and later publisher of the Chicago Sun-Times. The Chicago Sun-Times won 6 Pulitzers under his stewardship. And before that, he was publisher of the Daily News, and that won 1 Pulitzer under his leadership. For us, all these things, of course, are very important, but for us, the most important thing is that he's a member of the advisory board of the Center for Global Affairs, and as such, provides wonderful counsel and support for what we do. He will provide the context for tonight's discussion, so please help me to welcome Jim Hoge and tonight's panel and Arthur Miller.
Thank you very, very much, and welcome to all of you. The weather out there ain't so hot, so I'm really glad to see that you all made it. Tonight, as you've heard, we're going to talk about the election, which is very soon upon us. And I'm just going to give a very brief couple of opening comments because we have a very dynamic and, as you can see, large panel, and I don't want to get in their way. But in the campaign for the U.S. presidency, the main focus has been on domestic concerns about a lagging economy, a huge deficit, expensive health care provisions, and indeed the size and role of government itself. But in the final weeks before the November 6th election, international issues are receiving unexpected prominence. And that is so because unfolding events clearly challenge primary American interests of prosperity, security, and influence in today's globalized world. Top concerns include conflicts in the Middle East, faltering union in Europe, and the prospects of serious economic slowdown in China. Now, other pressing concerns are the heated rivalries in the seas off of China, Iran's drive to achieve nuclear capabilities, and potentially explosive instability in Pakistan, and lastly, relations between the West and the Islamic world. This election is in 5 weeks. Shortly after it, the winner will be facing a very tough problem, maybe the toughest he's going to have in the next administration, and that is what to do about the fiscal cliff. Without achieving some kind of bipartisan agreement in the Congress, large tax increases and drastic cuts in federal budgets will automatically kick in. That's the fiscal cliff. The consequences, domestic, I think you can almost feel them, But there are also big consequences of the fiscal cliff in U.S. military and diplomatic and economic relations overseas. Now, there are some brighter prospects for the incoming administration. One is the mounting drive that's underway to achieve, if not energy independence, at least more self-sufficiency. Expanding domestic oil and gas production could add jobs, revitalize manufacturing, and shrink the trade deficit. But the two candidates differ on the environmental concerns that have to be addressed as well for the new technologies of extraction which are coming down the pike. Now, in confronting these challenges and prospects, President Obama and Governor Romney are presenting differing views of America's role in the world. But once in office, one has to ask, how different would either one be from long-standing policies that are constrained by congressional, regulatory, and real-world barriers? We shall soon know. The panelists will assess the candidates' views, the challenges they would face, and public attitudes here and abroad. Mindful that the world is full of surprises, we will strive to shed some light on the global context of the 2012 election. Well, welcome to my wife. Glad you could make it. As I said, we have some very terrific panelists tonight, and I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, which is how they're seated. And as I call them off, please come up to I'm speaking over my shoulder now, come up to the stage. I think you have longer descriptions of them, so I'm just going to give you a quick label. Our first is Ian Bremmer. He's president of Eurasia Group. Ian? Robert Bryce, Senior Fellow, Center for Energy Policy. Wesley Clark, Senior Fellow, UCLA, Burkle Center. Les Gelb, President Emeritus, Council on Foreign Relations. And Malou Innocent, she is the Adjunct Fellow of Manhattan Institute. Let me correct that. She is the Foreign Policy Analyst at the Cato Institute. Welcome. And there's a big difference, isn't there? But the next one is from the Manhattan Institute, Judith Miller, Adjunct Fellow, Manhattan Institute. Edward Morse, Managing Director, City Research. Last, James Traub, columnist for foreignpolicy.com. Our moderator tonight is Arthur Miller, whom many of you know, and I have had the privilege of knowing him in a number of roles over a number of years. He is a leading scholar in the field of civil procedure and a renowned commentator on law and civil society. He is university professor at New York University and the NYU School of Continuing and Professional Studies. He is the author of more than 40 books and articles and the recipient of many honors. Now, most germane to what we're up to tonight, Arthur Miller is also an Emmy-winning moderator of several acclaimed PBS series, one of which I occasionally participated in, the famous Friendly Dialogues. Arthur, please come forward.
Thank you, Jim. Nice of you to join us. Let me explain what I think we're going to do. I said to these distinguished people, we're going to have a bull session. It's unstructured, spontaneous, and I hope that they will misbehave. My problem at the moment is the potential I have, which is infinite, to fall off the stage.
That is very different.
Now, if I do that, please leave quietly. Panelists, let's start on the most general level possible, talking about the candidates themselves. What is it in their worldview do you think will shape the next term, the next 4 years? Assuming one is elected versus the other, in terms of foreign policy. Les, what do you think?
I'm voting for Ralph Nader.
I hate to tell you that Ralph is a law school classmate of mine, and some of us have written him out of the class.
Well,
Others love him.
I hate to back off my vote for Nader, but allow me to do so. You know, what do I think about their worldviews? Romney doesn't have one.
That was easy.
I think it's very unfortunate. He's got, you know, a bunch of sort of staccato messages designed to irritate the Republican flock against Obama. And Obama will either be a willing victim in the debates, or he'll fight back. One of the characteristic things about his administration is they do a lot of things, they don't explain them well, and they don't do much fighting back. So I think that the test of their worldviews will come down to attack versus law school professor defend.
Well, we're both graduates of the Harvard Law School, which may be the ultimate damnation of them both.
I didn't want to say that.
Just to piggyback off of what Les just said, it's amazing that for the Obama campaign, that's known for being a well-oiled machine, that when it was in the White House, it came strikingly clear that there was a great deal of dysfunction, there was a discoordination between its messaging and its policy agenda. And I think part of that was because it allowed its opposition to... Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Excellent, thank you. Sorry about that. Did you hear roughly what I said earlier?
Start again.
Okay. Just that the Obama campaign, you know, 2008, 2007, 2008, it was very much a well-oiled machine. It was, you know, we called him the Teflon candidate because nothing really stuck to him. None of the criticisms really stuck. But he's, when he's in the White House, it's been known to, there's been this sort of incongruence between his messaging and his agenda. And there's a great deal of problems in terms of the opposition allowing sort of to control the debate and basically defining him as someone who is motivated by some deep-seated Kenyan anti-colonialism, this sort of very virulent anti-Muslim sentiment that's been shaping him. And I think overall, if he does get reelected, I think we're going to see even more of that. And it's going to really just galvanize the opposition against President Obama. Even if he's really embraced and expanded a lot of Bush's foreign policy agendas, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I just want to say something about this word worldview, because we use this word as if presidents and presidential candidates are academics. They have this thing called a worldview. A lot of presidential candidates have something like that on the domestic side, because they're governors. They've been doing this for many years. Very few of them have a worldview in the real sense about foreign policy. What they have are intuitions. I'm the kind of person who thinks blank. And one of the problems with a worldview is that those intuitions often prove to be profoundly wrong. So George Bush had a worldview, that is George W. Bush. I'm a realist, I have a realist worldview. Then the world changed in front of him, and he suddenly completely abandoned what had appeared to be his principles and carried out a foreign policy that couldn't have been more different from the worldview he had. And I would say it probably took him 4 or 5 years to realize how mistaken he was, and then, to some extent, return to that worldview. One thing I would say for Obama, who, by the way, had a worldview because he was an intellectual, not because he knew the world. He didn't, but he was an intellectual. He was an academic. So if you had talked to him in 2007, he could give you a coherent sense of the world. I think that's changed a lot too. But because so much of his worldview had to do with prudence, I mean, I think that was kind of his big intuition, is you can't change the world as much as you wish you could. I would say, and I just had this conversation with someone I was talking to today, anyway, one of my colleagues, who said, you know, Obama has learned from his mistakes faster by far than Bush and than most other presidents do. So yes, he had a worldview. Yes, it turned out the world didn't match it. Yes, he's changed. But if you look, it hasn't done that much damage. He hasn't changed radically. He's essentially a prudential figure, and he remains one, to my mind.
Going
Look, I
forward.
think that their policies are actually going to be quite similar if they're in office on many, many issues of foreign policy. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that. I think their worldviews are actually very different. I don't believe either of them are Kenyan. I don't know what that means. It's kind of ideological silliness. Hopefully we'll get into that too. But when I think about what Obama represents, it is clearly an understanding and a focus that over the course of the last 10, 20 years, the United States has lost a lot of its credibility with international interlocutors. Why? Because of Guantanamo and because of Abu Ghraib on human rights, because of Enron and because of Accenture, Anderson on consulting, because of Madoff and because of Lehman on support for the free market and an open financial system, even because of Bush Gore, because of the promotion of democratic rights. And Obama focuses on that as creation of more multilateralism, more understanding of different ways, more tolerance, more interlocution. Romney looks at exactly the other side. It's as if the last 20 years didn't happen, but Romney gets the fact that America does have exceptional values and that those values are not the moral equivalents of values that are promulgated by the Chinese. And you see this in Romney talking about the free market, however inarticulately. You see this in Romney talking about, I mean, seriously, we know that he's got problems right now, but he does actually focus on those values. And his piece in the Wall Street Journal the last couple of days says that again, even if it doesn't say what he's going to do. I think those are dramatically different worldviews. They do both see halves of what would be a coherent whole, but no one is going to bring us that coherent whole.
Jim, I've known you a long time, and I know when you smirk, you have something to say.
A little bit of what you've already heard. I mean, I agree with the other Jim here that...
That's why we're sitting together, right? Just to make it easier.
I thought it was we were bonding.
Left wing?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think this happens more with some presidents than others, but happens with all of them, which is they learn in office. And the worldview they bring does not necessarily change at the core, but it certainly changes in the atmosphere and the way it's presented. Obama, for example, I think still believes in the multilateral world and that whether we like it or not, or whether it's working well or not, the only way to go forward in addressing big problems in the world is through multinational efforts, through sort of regional forums and the rest of it. Romney, I think, is the bigger question mark because there is very little to suggest what his worldview is. Beyond the fact that I think he's sort of, they say he's frozen as a Cold War warrior, he has a view of America and of American dominance that is probably 15 or 20 years out of date. So if he were to win the election, I think the amount of learning he's going to have to do to catch up with the way the world really is and what kind of role we can play is going to be much, much greater and in some ways a little bit more perilous.
Judith, I see you nodding.
Well, it's always dangerous to disagree with Jim Hoge because he's right a lot of the times. But Jim, I would put it slightly differently. I think that Romney understands what the absence of American leadership can mean. When you look at the slaughter in Syria, and you see what didn't happen in Libya until the United States pretended to be, quote, leading from behind, but basically those were American planes and NATO, and this was, even though people like to say it wasn't an American initiative, after it was over, the Obama people were very quick to say Libya was an American accomplishment, now looking not quite so accomplished or good. But I think there is a difference in terms of Romney's view, true, untested, untried, and entirely theoretical at this point, of what an American president and America needs to do and be. So I wouldn't say dominance, I would say American leadership, Whether or not he figures out once he's in office, if he ever gets there, and now that's not looking very likely, but everything can change in politics. Once he figures out that America may not be able to afford as assertive and aggressive a policy as he would like to carry out, that's a different thing. But I do see a different worldview, and I see one man who doesn't talk a lot about American leadership, but actually often exercises it, and another who's still talking about it, and we have no idea what he'll do.
How on earth does he
becomes
exercise leadership?
No,
Romney.
no, I'm talking about Obama exercising leadership. He has done that in a number of very important instances, but I don't think that.
But Romney
Romney,
understands leadership?
He has yes, he's
What
actually.
does he understand about it?
Everything he's done pretty well, Les. He has I think the great mystery of Romney is why he's not able to explain how he's been able to do so well in 3 separate enterprises: Bain Capital Business, the Olympics, which is an international gathering of very difficult people, and governor of Massachusetts. And yet he's done pretty well at all of those. And now he's not doing well as a candidate. And to me, that's the great mystery.
Well, apparently being able to explain things is not a part of leadership.
Well, about the lack of...
I just want to come in on this and what Judy said, because I don't think a president who takes over the command of the armed forces in war can come out of that untouched. I think it's one thing to have a great worldview and talk about American leadership and how wonderful. I think it's another thing to be at the air base when they bring the coffins back, or go to Walter Reed and see kids who are permanently maimed because of your decisions. And I think George W. Bush felt that enormously. And I think that President Obama feels it very, very heavily. And I think that once you start confronting the human costs of these decisions, a lot of the bluster and rhetoric should go out the window. And I think it has in this administration. You don't see it, and you still hear it from those that want to get in power. And I just hope that if they do get in power, the first thing they do is go to Walter Reed and meet some of the consequences of bad decision making.
Just to piggyback off that, I think part of the problem with Romney is his inability to really articulate what his policies really mean. I mean, he talks a lot about American exceptionalism, why the next century should be an American century, and it sounds just as arrogant here as it does abroad. And he doesn't really define exactly what he means. Does he mean that he will intervene in Syria? Does it mean that he'll intervene in foreign civil conflicts and put American troops in harm's way more often? Does it mean that he can shape events to America's liking? It's really just, there's not a real serious position when we talk about this American exceptionalism that Romney continues to promote.
But I think you can say something even further, which is not just that it's buddy, it's that it's self-contradictory. I mean, what I felt most about Romney's criticism of Obama is that they come from all possible directions at once. And so he criticizes Obama for not promoting democracy enough in the Arab world. He criticizes Obama for abandoning our autocratic allies in the Arab world. Now, I think the reason for that is that there are profoundly contradictory strains inside the party he represents. And because Romney himself doesn't have strong convictions in these things, he gets pushed in both directions. And so he winds up sounding incoherent, I think because, as Les said in the beginning, he doesn't really have a strong set of convictions from which he might occasionally depart.
Right.
If I can just add one point, and I think just to build on that point on the incoherence, the part that I look at the budget issue, and Romney says, well, I'm going to devote 4% of GDP to the military. Well, how in the world are you going to manage that and balance the budget? I mean, yes, we need a strong defense, but why 4%? Why not 3.75? I mean, General, you can speak to that as well as anyone, but the Pentagon takes in a great deal of discretionary funding in this country, and if we're going to have rational fiscal policy, we have to rein in the military as part of that.
So I'll speak to that.
By all means. Go ahead.
You know, it doesn't make sense to have a fixed percentage of GDP.
Yeah, thank you.
What you have to have is a strategy, and then you have to figure out you want all the defense you need and not more than you can afford. The problem we've got in the security aspect right now is you can't deal with China by putting 2,000 Marines in Australia. It's just not very impressive. In fact, it's provocative, if anything. The way you deal with China is by creating jobs, strengthening the economy, developing new technologies, and showing the Chinese that they've still got lessons to learn from us, rather than having the Chinese ask why America can't create jobs the way China does. Until we've built back the strength in the American economy, these numbers for defense and deployments and so forth, they ring a little hollow. Now, that's not to say that there's anything wrong with the forces we've got, and I certainly wouldn't want our Chinese friends to be under the misperception that there couldn't be an incident and America wouldn't respond, because all it would take is a spark and this country would come together in a flash. And so I always tell my friends from China to be very, very careful, even though we're not creating jobs. We're a very, very powerful country. We could create a lot of jobs if we had a cause to bring the country together, and we don't want that cause.
Look, I think that both Obama and Romney accept the fact that the way you ultimately deal with China is by improving American competitiveness, sure. But I mean, to focus on worldviews, and that's what we're talking about here, Obama has started to, with Hillary Clinton and others leading the way, developed a fairly coherent worldview. It's around two separate things. The first is the pivot to Asia, and the second is the notion of economic statecraft. And you put both of those together, and you get something which is very coherent, which is that we're worried about China. That actually the way you make or break foreign policy in the U.S. is not on the Middle East, which is what secretaries of state have been saying for a very long time, but it's in Asia. And it's in Asia that America's allies are begging us to play a more substantial role. They are concerned about China. Now, where I really do agree with you is that given that the U.S. historically does defense policy better than anything else with our allies in Asia, we've got a hammer. And so everything looks like a nail. And so we go to Indonesia, and we don't focus on the G20, we focus on F-16s. We go to Australia, and we're sending in Marines to Darwin, and we're not helping the Australians figure out how to combat state capitalism because we just don't do economic statecraft well. That needs to adapt. But I do believe you have the beginnings of a coherent Obama doctrine around these two strains of Asia policy. And I think it is a shift from where we've been before.
I think it's really important that we're working Asia, but I think if you were to look at the way we've handled these issues around the South China Sea, that maybe we would be more effective if we went to China first and said, we're hearing a lot of rumblings out there. People don't kind of like how you're pushing us and how you're pushing your weight around. How about we sit down and talk about it? But instead, it's come across the opposite way, in which we've heard the rumblings, we've said, you all better get together because China's coming. And it's put us in a way that's going to make it more difficult to deal with the next force in China.
I think the description of our worldview as being the Asia pivot plus economics is a pretty good one, but it's one where we have to be very careful. It's not totally new. We have had a sort of dual-level policy towards China and Asia for some time now. The first was, let's engage, but carefully. If engagement works, we're all better off. If it doesn't, then we go to the second sort of sub-rosa strategy, which is we'll constrain them. Contain is too strong a word, but that involves building an archipelago of allies all around China. It involves trade policies and the rest. Now, when we went public with the pivot, we scared isn't the wrong word. We bred even further suspicion among the Chinese as to what it is we were up to.
Exactly.
And we don't want, I think, to have them think that we really are embarked on a containment program, because that's going to lead to fisticuffs at some point.
Looking in from out there, what's your judgment as to the relative credibility of each of these two men at this point? Judith, you're shaking your head.
I don't think you can judge that yet, because we've had 4 years of experience with one, and we have, a man who makes a lot of promises and has a foreign policy advisory staff that represents everybody from, the Tea Party to traditional conservative Republicans. it's impossible for me to say what Romney would or wouldn't do in office yet.
So you're echoing Les's.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why it's interesting to me that Obama has tried to, keep foreign policy reduced to a bumper sticker. Osama bin Laden dead, GM alive. Next, if I had that record, that's what I do too. But Romney has been unable to attack on the national security and foreign policy fronts until now, until Libya. This is the first time we've seen a kind of crack in that Mr. Competence, Mr. I've got a realistic worldview of how to work with other people and when to exercise leadership. This is the first time we see some vulnerability, and he's been flailing around looking for it for a long time.
There have been real attacks. I mean, come on. Clearly the willingness to go after China in a harsher view, which is what Wes Clark is responding to, saying day one, sort of currency manipulator. However unfathomable that actually is in practice, I think has landed a couple punches. Obama tells Medvedev, we can work something out. There'll be flexibility after the election. And then, you sort of see, sort of Romney saying this is our lead geopolitical foe. Okay, you can say that's 20 years ago, but also that's showing that Obama actually has vulnerabilities and cozying up to someone that's not attractive to American values.
He's not, but he's still 3 points ahead by everybody's polls.
The GOP has lost their historical advantage on foreign policy and national security. It's in direct relation because of the Iraq War and because, well, they lost Osama bin Laden when they were in charge. Those are huge black eyes on the GOP right now. And I think when you saw earlier this month, in fact, a Pew Research poll showed that Obama outstrips Romney on issues and traits concerning sound leadership, strong leadership, ability to make a wise decision in a crisis. I mean, these are the core competencies of any president. And if anything, I think we can look back to 2008, where we saw McCain, who was a war hero. He had decades of foreign policy experience. He endorsed a surge in Iraq. In fact, he said that he'd be fine with staying for another 100 years in Iraq. And instead, the American public went with Obama, who was an untested neophyte, largely. So I think what we've seen is the GOP, they've lost their historical edge. And we've seen this over the past 10 years. And I think whenever Romney, again, he talks about American exceptionalism, it's just more chest thumping. There's no coherence in this message. And so it's not resonating with the American people.
But, it's intriguing to think what a coherent Republican response might be. Clearly, whatever that response should be, it's not coming from Romney. And I think Malo's quite right in saying that the problem is there's not a position to Obama's right that's politically useful on foreign policy. On domestic policy, yeah, there probably is. On foreign policy, it's kind of like Clinton with welfare reform. He has inoculated the Democrats against this traditional charge. So when I try to think, well, what space is there? There are several possibilities. One is less foreign policy. Bring them home. America can't afford to have the kind of imperial stretch that it has now. That's, of course, not Romney's view. It was the view of some of his contestants in the Republican primary. Another would be, and this is quite natural to Romney, but he won't say it, free trade. Romney doesn't believe this China stuff. Romney's a free trader. And you could go, there was a speech he gave 3 years ago where he gave, I thought, an incredibly clear explanation for why free trade with China is good for America. We can't say that now.
Jim, the problem he's got in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy, is that the Republican Party is totally fragmented, and he has to try and straddle a horse that is too broad.
Yeah.
For example, take the issue of military intervention. He is for arming troops that are already there in Syria, but not sending our own. Let's take Afghanistan. He's criticizing what has happened, but he doesn't want to stay after 2014. Right. And on it goes like this. Positions which are contradictory because he has different constituencies he's trying to serve. And since he's not a leader of any one of them himself, it's a damn difficult assignment.
So what happens after the election? More of the same, more, call it incoherence or lack of centrality to a policy?
Look, if he brings the neocons back into the government with him, there will be absolute incoherence and a war with Iran. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But I don't think the neocons are all that powerful. He's got a lot of them on his advisory group, too many. But he also has people on that advisory group who I think represent the finest traditions of realism in the Republican Party. And he can make a pretty strong critique of Obama on traditional realist grounds. You know, it's true Obama has done 3.5 years where he hasn't committed costly mistakes. And that's quite a feat in American foreign policy. All of us who have watched this business pray for the absence of costly mistakes. It's even better than a worldview. Nice. But where Obama can be hit is this. He has avoided the costly mistakes and deserves good credit for it, but he hasn't shown any evidence of a strategy. And a strategy is where you really can accomplish long-term benefits. Wherever he's done, he is given with one hand and taken back with another. He does this surge in Afghanistan that made no sense at all. And now we're backing off from it, and he'll pay the price from it. And it's worth Romney's calling attention to this, because it's kind of an incoherent policy right now. He's had toing and froing on the Arab Spring. He supports elections in Egypt, but he runs away from democracy in Bahrain. He supports rebellion in Libya, but not in Syria. It's not clear, because Obama hasn't explained it, what he's up to with these things. In the case of China, as several others here have mentioned, he wants to engage them, and it doesn't seem he's clear about what the carrots are, what the sticks are. So there's plenty to go after, but it's just that Romney isn't listening to his smartest advisors. He's got people on his advisory group like Steve Hadley, like Bob Zellick, like Mike Hayden, who are really very able, but there's no evidence that they're reaching his ear.
Who is?
Yes,
let me phrase it differently. The selection of Representative Ryan as his vice president. What does that tell us about the influence Ryan may have on him, foreign policy going forward, should they be elected?
Well, he obviously listened to Donald Duck in choosing Ryan. You know, how could you choose somebody like that guy? If he had any record
for his
before,
foreign policy views,
yeah, he's a foreign policy
whatever
expert.
they are.
Les, I'm delighted that you don't feel too strongly about these things.
But, you know, I just want to step back for a second from the panel, because we are talking about an election here. And we're pretty much down into the fine-grained detail of policies, incoherence, inconsistencies, parts of the world that if you go outside, maybe New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and a few other urban areas, people have no idea where these places are. What they know is what they hear, and what's repeated is a charge. It's not a policy, but it sounds like a policy. When you say American exceptionalism, we're going to be stronger, more robust, that sounds like a policy to people out there. And of course, it's not anything but empty rhetoric, but it sounds like a policy. Most of America doesn't read beyond the first line in a story, because they see the same story many times. They see the same first line, they think, I know that already. What they know is that Romney talks tough. He's going to have a strong foreign policy. He's going to stand up for America. And
Don't forget, he won't apologize.
He won't apologize.
He won't apologize.
I see this every day in my West Point classmates' response. Obama has apologized. And no matter how many times someone comes on the net and says, where did he apologize? It never gets answered. And the same charge comes up again and again. And so you have to appreciate that the foreign policy debate, even more than the economic debate, is about slogans, it's about abstractions, it's about some gender roles of the parties, maybe, you know, with the Republicans being the daddy party, the Democrats being the mommy party, kinder and gentler, and that's the way it's conveyed. All the policy nuances are important to us, but it's really hard to get them across to the voters.
So this is why I mentioned the Kenyan anti-colonialism of Obama. I mean, one of the most popular documentaries out right now is 2016, Obama's America. It's a movie that was inspired by a book by Dinesh D'Souza. I mean,
Have you seen it?
No.
Are you sure you haven't seen it?
No.
Has anybody here seen 2016?
It's going viral on
But it's one of the highest grossing documentaries in history.
It's a big hit out.
I mean, so there is a pocket of the electorate that gravitates to that message, and sort of that knee-jerk reaction of Obama's.
You said a pocket. They're all here.
Right here.
Out there, it's what Wes says, isn't it?
Right. I mean, I agree with Wes's point in the sense that there is a demographic in society that, I mean, for example, 2 days before the announcement of Osama bin Laden's death, Barack Obama released his long-form birth certificate. I mean, that's what we were talking about, whether or not Obama was born in Hawaii or not. I mean, can you have a rational discussion about foreign policy with the large segment of society that doesn't even believe that the president was born in America? I mean, the worldviews, if we're talking about worldview, is we don't even respect our president. There's no legitimacy there. And when you begin to systemically undermine the legitimacy of your own president, then it doesn't matter what he says. It doesn't matter how similar his policies are.
We have to understand that foreign policy is usually dealt with in slogans in campaigns, and not very much even then, because it's too dangerous to do it any other way. So I think we have to separate out what is being said by Romney and Arthur's question, what might happen if he was elected. We only have a very few signs, but one I would warrant taking a look at from here on out is that he did make Bob Zoellick the head of his foreign policy advisory team. Now, Zoellick is one of the most experienced, most cautious, old-fashioned Republican internationalists that you could come by. Who got the maddest about this? Romney's neoconservative advisors. How'd it fit? Now, does that mean, what does it mean? But it means to me that Romney may be talking the way he's talking in the campaign because his base, far right wing, absolutely is going to go crazy if he doesn't. But that once he's elected, and then I'll quit, Les. Once he's elected, please. I think you'll see him go the way of Bob Zoellick.
This is like when Barack Obama gets reelected, he's going to finally solve the Israel-Palestine problem.
Let me just tell you what he said about Bob Zoellick. First of all, he didn't appoint him to be his current foreign policy advisor. He said he's going to be head of my national security transition team. And then the roof caved in because every neocon who could still speak English protested. And then Romney said, but of course I'm not going to appoint him Secretary of State. That's what he said.
He didn't say John Bolton's got the job yet, did he?
No.
Well, let me ask
but you can push
exactly
for
that. What's your best guess as to who Romney would appoint as Secretary?
Well, leaving aside the person, I would like to say this mildly hopeful thing. Romney is under, I think, much more pressure on domestic issues from the right than he is on foreign policy issues, just because people don't care as much. And so my guess is that he is going to have to honor his worst promises on domestic policy if he becomes president, but he might not have to honor his worst promises on foreign policy.
So in an ideal world, who would Romney select
Can I just
as
jump
the
in here?
Secretary of State?
Well, I appreciate the question, but can I just make one quick point? How much of the electorate really cares? Apologies to all the foreign policy experts up here. This election, in my view, is going to be decided on domestic policy.
Right, but what we're trying to do, I thought, this evening, is project forward.
Fair enough. But you posed the question before about his selection of Ryan. That was all about domestic politics. That's all about Wisconsin. It's all about the fiscal
So your
issues.
answer to the question might have been that Ryan will have no effect in terms of foreign policy.
What foreign
As
policy
opposed to
experience
Biden, who might have an
Right.
effect.
What
I think
experience?
that's right.
What
But I do think.
But keep in mind that Obama's going to lose, it appears, Hillary Clinton.
That's right.
Now, with Obama losing Clinton, it is interesting to conjecture who Obama might appoint as Secretary of State. or who Romney might appoint the Secretary of State.
Arthur, you're assuming that Secretary of State's the most important job in carrying out foreign policy, which God knows in the Obama administration is not remotely true. It's the National Security Advisor.
Why is it you refuse to answer the question?
It's just too dangerous, Arthur. We're not willing to go there.
I wouldn't accept that from a first-year law student.
I think John Kerry is a good, safe choice to be Secretary of State. Not sure he's going to be picked, but it's certainly out there.
I think it's more likely to
I
be
think
Susan Rice.
Yeah, me too.
I think Susan Rice certainly has to be considered by the Obama team as someone who could be Secretary of State. Now, it was easier to consider her before she was attacked so viciously by, I guess it was Peter King who did this and called for her to resign. But there are a lot of luminaries in the Democratic Party who are out there, who are serving currently, who he could put in that position. But it's what Jim says. It's not, President Obama, he does his own foreign policy.
Absolutely.
It's his, that's what he does. He does foreign policy.
And Hillary has done nothing?
Hillary has worked as a tremendous contributor to the Obama team.
And she does seem to have some credibility in some
Got tremendous
quarters.
credibility.
But
And that's law.
she's
But
a
she's
diplomat.
a team member.
She's basically a diplomat. I've never seen such a centralized foreign policy decision-making ever. Almost everything comes to Obama. And it's not as if they even discuss foreign policy options at that table at the NSC. He goes back into the Oval Office and contemplates his head.
But Obama is a fundamentally risk-averse guy when it comes to foreign policy, and that's why I thought one of the smart things that Les said, and there have been many, is that there haven't been a lot of big mistakes made on foreign policy in this administration. Let's be very clear. If you look at the constituency out there in the U.S., there's not a lot of folks that are supporting more assertive, do more, be more engaged, be the global policeman, be the lender of last resort, sort of be out there. We're not doing that. What I find very interesting about Romney versus Obama in terms of foreign policy going forward is there's one big, strong, powerful constituency for doing more internationally as the United States. That's industry, right? And CEOs in this country hate Obama. And they're very close to Romney. Even though they don't like his candidacy, they'll absolutely play a more significant role. You'll see the private sector more engaged. So in some ways, you would actually expect a Romney administration to be more engaged and out there on foreign policy issues, including, most importantly, free trade, than you would see a second-term Obama administration, because the domestic constituency and political factors that really matter and drive this stuff are going to be moving in that direction.
You're shaking your head. You're agreeing.
Maybe.
Maybe. A qualified
well,
maybe.
I'm not going to quarrel with Ian. Has tremendous experience in all of this, and it's clear that Romney has the backing in general of the business community. There's no question. And yeah, do they want free trade? Sure. And I think that's in terms of foreign policy. What is going to be the foreign policy big decision for Obama and Romney is going to be about energy and energy exports from the United States. Given, and Ed Morrison has written about this, will the U.S. allow crude oil exports? What about coal exports now that the U.S. has tremendous coal resources that are destined for foreign markets because they're being displaced here domestically?
Or how could we even have this discussion? Of course we have to allow these exports.
Well,
Of course we do.
Of course we do.
We should be putting in gas liquefaction plants left and right. We should be pulling that gas out. We should be undercutting the price of oil, the $18 price for gas in Asia. We should go back to the position that we had in the 50s where we were a major oil exporting country. Why wouldn't we do that? It's good for the economy. It's good for the United States. Unless, and then we have the leverage to say, okay, but there's something out there called climate change, and in return for our oil exports, we're going to have a second phase behind this where we're moving away from hydrocarbons.
Well, I'll take your point, but there are powerful segments in the Democratic Party that are very much opposed to that. Sierra Club is trying very hard to block coal exports. The Democrats are spoken against LNG exports from the United States. So, yeah, there are very strong constituencies within the Democratic Party.
Well, I know, but I think this goes back to this issue of what's the strategy.
Actually, the major opponents of LNG exports are Republicans. They're mostly corporations.
Well,
they're mostly companies that are saying, this is our gas, it's
Yeah.
cheap, and we want it as feedstock. We want to use it for petrochemical plants. We don't want it.
Yeah.
No, that's
probably
fair,
true,
fair
but
enough, and there's
plenty-
strange bedfellows there. The
You
American
can keep-
Chemistry Council is
We're
opposed to it.
flaring gas in North Dakota. We can't even, it's not even worth enough to build a pipeline for it. Just burn it. And, you know, if you look at where we are as a government, we have every year, every 4 years, we do a quadrennial defense review. And the Pentagon gets together and we figure out what the national military strategy is, and we write papers on it, and we can tell you if you cut us another 1% and we go to war, that's another 10,000 casualties, and everybody gets all up in arms. No one does this on the economy. Now, I know it's probably too hot to handle, but we're one of the few countries which can't actually create a national economic strategy. I'm not talking about planning. I'm just talking about a strategy.
That's socialism, sir.
That's exactly what Stephen Hadley said to me when I said it. It sounds like it, but actually, we've always had an economic strategy. We built the defense industrial complex. That was an economic strategy. Built the interstate highway system. We can't now think about those issues?
What about, I mean,
Let me ask Ed,
yeah, go ahead.
give us the picture of energy in the future and how these two candidates might affect that future.
The good thing about what's happening with energy is that it's stayed away from politics. There's this remarkable revolution taking place in the U.S. where
Speak up.
it's not me, it's the mic, sorry.
Pull it up a little. That's better.
Having fun. Having fun? Arthur, we're having fun.
This country has responded to high oil prices and high gas prices like no other country in the world. And it's led the world in hydrocarbon development for 5 straight years. So it's not me, it's the mic. So you want me to take another mic?
No, just keep going, Ed.
Okay, so the U.S. is the fastest growing oil producing country and gas producing country in the world. We've now outranked Russia to be the #1 gas supplier.
Are we faster growing than Brazil's offshore production?
Absolutely, not only in the last 5 years altogether, but in the last year. Thank you very much. We're #1, 1 million barrels a day, oil and natural gas liquids, and we'll be doing this for the next 5 or 10 years. #2 has been Iraq. Iraq is if we're adding 1 million barrels a day. Thank you. Iraq is adding 400,000 or 500,000 barrels a day, and then right after that is Canada. Brazil is down on the pole, and you just need a couple more years of what's happening for some remarkable numbers. In 2007, when we were the worst in terms of oil consumption, we were consuming more than 20 million barrels a day. We were importing 12 million a day. We have now reduced our pull on the world by 4.6 million barrels a day in 4.5 years. And that number, 4.6 million a day of our reduced appetite on the world market, is more than the oil production of Iraq, more than the oil production of Iran, more than the oil production of every country in the world other than ourselves, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. And at this rate, by 2018, we're going to be self-sufficient.
But does that mean that
I
talking
want to
about
make sure
climate
we
change
add
is
that there's 1 million
ridiculous?
barrels a day, almost 1 million barrels a day of ethanol in that mix.
Ethanol has gone in that mix from 400,000 barrels a day in, it's an interesting number, in 2007. Our ethanol consumption now is 1 million a day, but we're exporting 300,000 barrels a day.
Ethanol is the longest running robbery of taxpayers in this country's history. It is the biggest scam on the American taxpayer in modern history. It is not an energy program, it is a farm
We're in
subsidy
cowboy
program.
boots up here. Does that say you're like with the feedlot crowd? You
Now,
want cheap corn?
Now, General, you're going
must be
to
from
make me make fun of your
Nebraska, corn
footwear, and you don't want to go there.
I'm wearing NATO shoes.
Ed, what does this do to the whole move toward renewable energy?
Well, on the one hand, we're killing carbon in a big way. Our carbon greenhouse gas emissions are about what they were 20 years ago. And a large part of that is we have this natural gas revolution. If we looked at our coal consumption 2 years ago, it was 900 million tons. Our coal consumption is now 800 million tons. Pretty soon it's going to be 600 million tons. Our carbon footprint is really very quickly eroding. And by the way, the Europeans who are pushing the banner of, let's get rid of carbon and let's have carbon trading and let's do renewables, their carbon footprint is going up. Just as we're increasing our gas consumption, in Europe they're increasing their coal consumption and reducing their gas consumption.
Do you see any difference in the two candidates in terms of this picture you paint about where we're going?
Oh, sure. You know, Romney has adopted an energy independence philosophy. He may have been a little bit inarticulate about what he means by it, but he's adopted a policy of energy independence. And Obama's counterpart to that is all of the above. And what does that mean? Because he's not really pro-hydrocarbon. He's pro-renewable. He's pro-wind and solar, and you can't do much in the way of a new energy resource base by pushing solar and wind.
If you're right that we may be on a path toward self-sufficiency, what does that do to our relations with our energy partners, Canada, Mexico, the Gulf?
Well, Canada has no choice but to export their growing dirty oil exports to the U.S. They're not going to, there probably are no two countries in the world that have a more inept government when it comes to managing the energy sector than Canada and the United States. And when it comes to building pipelines, they're even worse than we are politically. So
that's very reassuring.
They have
Venezuela's
a lot of production, and it can't go to the Pacific because there are too many people in the middle between the Rockies and the Pacific that want a piece of that pie. So they're not building pipelines. That means they're exporting to the U.S., and we're pushing out exports from everyone else. And the West African countries are already seeing it. 2 years ago, we were importing 1 million barrels a day from Nigeria. A year ago, it was 800,000 barrels a day. This year, it's 400 a day. Next year, maybe nothing, because the rate of growth of our production is so great. And with this Canadian flow into the U.S., we're going to push out Saudi Arabia, we're going to push out Venezuela. And by the way, we'll push out Mexico, because Mexico can ship oils to somebody else on land, on water. It's a waterborne exporter, and Canada has no choice but exporting to the U.S.
But it also, if you think about how, I mean, I think the real brunt of your question, Arthur, think about the way it would change our relationship with the Middle East. So if you had to list the countries with whom the United States has the most hypocritical relationships, Saudi Arabia clearly wins. The United States believes that it did democracy promotion and so forth. Nobody can even begin to mistake Saudi Arabia for any kind of democracy. Not only does the United States have to, let's just use, say, coddle Saudi Arabia, less mention Bahrain. Why has the United States been unable or unwilling to say anything about Bahrain? Well, because Bahrain is a Saudi Arabian, in effect, protectorate. All of these things are true, not only because the Saudis play an important stabilizing role in the Middle East, but because we depend upon them for oil. Insofar as we can diminish our dependence on the Saudis, but of course also on the Iraqis and others, we can pursue a policy in the Middle East that is much closer to our other national interests besides the key national interest of having access to oil.
I think there are really three critical issues on the U.S. and its future when it comes to energy. One is exactly the point you just made. It's time to have a value-based foreign policy, not corrupted by having to deal with unsavory governments around the world. But secondly and thirdly, and much more importantly, if there were two big Achilles heels in U.S. presence in the world and U.S. superpower status, it's the current account deficit on the one hand, and its vulnerabilities associated with oil imports on the other hand. And guess what? Both of those are going to go away by the end of this decade. And there's no other country in the world, not China by any stretch of the imagination, that's going to be in the position of invulnerability to the degree that the U.S. will be when it comes to the end of this decade. That doesn't mean a time to pull back, because it's still the case that our borders are effectively the globe as a whole. But it sure makes a difference in terms of where we stand versus the Chinese and anyone else.
I agree with everything you've just said until you got to values-based foreign policy, and that's where there's a very big debate. I mean, from a values-based foreign policy perspective, your response on Syria is going to be very different from a, you know what, this isn't our problem perspective on foreign policy. I mean, 18+ months, 20+ thousand dead Syrians, clearly starting to have an impact on Jordan, on Turkey, on Iraq. But if Syria falls apart, it's a much bigger problem for lots of other countries than it is for the United States. Afghanistan falls apart. It's a much bigger problem for many other countries than the U.S. I was talking to some Chinese officials a while back, and I said, you know, the Brits, the Soviets, the Americans have all done Afghanistan. isn't it your turn? and their response was, not it. Well, you know, a values-based U.S. foreign policy is a radically different kind of foreign policy than one that actually focuses on baseline American interests. And I think that tension is going to become much more apparent in either next administration that we see.
Well, you know, we've tried to roll these things together. We've tried to say America's strategic interests are our values. And we made a big case of that during the 1990s. But I agree with what you say. I mean, if we go to a values-based foreign policy, we'll be facing some enormous costs that maybe we should look at twice before we endorse those costs. I think we need a strategy-based foreign policy. What is it that America can do? What is it that we need to do? And how do we move forward in the world? I'm a little bit concerned that we may be a little too triumphalist in terms of American energy independence, because even when we are energy independent, and I fully endorse trying to get there, and I hope your figures are right. I'm not sure that they are because it depends on a number of other factors. We still are in a world in which there are millions of tons of carbon being pumped out, and we know what the impact is in terms of global warming. And as much as we all love the free market, we also know the free market really isn't free, and that it exists because people make it work, and that we know we've got to have enough foresight to look to the future. And so we can't throw out the renewables, the solar energy, the biofuels. We can't. And I would just say, in terms of the ripoff to the American taxpayer on ethanol, actually the American taxpayer has gotten really good value out of that. We've generated the farm incomes, we've generated the biotech revolution, we've generated more crop production, and there is no subsidy today for ethanol. It's just out there in the marketplace, and people are buying it because
if I may, please. 40% of U.S. corn, it's 15% of all global corn, it's 5% of all global grain.
Yes, but
is being diverted into the corn ethanol scam in the United States to produce 0.7% of the world's oil needs. This is a terrible idea. It was a terrible idea when it started. The UN has asked, the UN World Food Program and the World Agriculture Organization asked.
Your facts are wrong and your analysis is wrong. Okay? Fine. Here's why the facts are wrong. First of all, when you put...
I love it when they talk dirty.
Arthur, you said we should interrupt when we disagree.
I did. You said guilty.
That's what it was.
If we can move beyond biofuels, I agree with many of the things that Ed said, but where I disagree, oil is still going to be priced on the international market. Whatever happens in the United States.
I didn't say it wasn't, by the way.
Okay, well, it is going to be priced on the international market. It's true U.S. oil production is soaring, and that's a positive thing for jobs, for balance of trade. But I cannot foresee a scenario where the U.S. forsakes control of the Strait of Hormuz, or moves out of the Middle East in a major way with regard to the Israelis or the Kuwaitis or the Saudis.
See, I got to go back on the biofuels thing. It may be just a footnote. It may be just 7/10. It is an American industry. We created it. If you want a country to grow economically, you have to nurture the creativity of the people in these different industries. Now, we're all proud of Bill Gates.
It's a farm handout.
It's a wonderful thing Steve Jobs did with Apple. There are people out there whose names you all don't know who live in South Dakota and Iowa who are just as creative, just as good a leader, just as effective in building businesses as Steve Jobs and other high-tech entrepreneurs whose hands are clean, their hands are dirty. They happen to be working with machinery, with farm instruments, and they've actually built a huge enterprise.
And if you gave me mandates and subsidies for 20 years, I could do it too.
When you go abroad, people ask me, they said, how do we get ethanol to our country? I said, do you want ethanol? I said, yes. I said, why? I said, because it puts value in the land. And corn ethanol, first of all, it doesn't use 40% of the corn crop. It returns a lot of that right back into the food chain. If you actually look at how much it's used, it's 16%. Secondly, when you drive up the price of corn, that's the drought that's doing that. That's not ethanol. What ethanol is doing is stabilizing the price of corn. So that way a farmer can earn a return. When you're dealing in the energy sector, you're dealing in the biggest fight in the world. Go to a conference in Aspen on energy and you'll find oil hates gas, oil and gas hate solar, oil, gas, and solar hate biofuels.
Wes, if I may.
And this is an industry.
Would you?
This is an industry, Les.
Let me interrupt you before we descend into pork rinds in this discussion. I
don't get the connection.
I don't think it's
ahead.
pork rinds, Les. I think it's a different kind of pork.
When I woke up, this morning, I didn't think I was going to preside over a riot about ethanol. Yeah. Go ahead, Les.
You said you were going to talk about energy.
I know, as much as I hate to get away from that discussion, I fear where it's leading. Look, I don't apologize for this kind of discussion at all. This is a good substantive discussion.
Darn right.
It's terrific. And that's really our job. We've been talking before, you know, what do the candidates say? What's the relevance of what we say to what they say? And, you know, we're the woolly-headed intellectuals that nobody pays attention to, and they're the bobbleheads. So, you know, what are we supposed to do? I think we're doing exactly the right thing in what we're talking about up here, and in what virtually everybody in this panel writes about on some regular basis. This is good, important stuff. Now, why the hell do we do it? We do it in the vain hope that we can directly influence the people who are advising the candidates. It hardly ever works. But we also aim at a culprit that nobody's mentioned in this foreign policy discussion, namely the press. See, we try to influence the press. We try to inject some substance into what they say about foreign policy because they are reaching the people and they are reaching the candidates. And that is a principal problem in our having a decent discussion about foreign policy in this country or about having a decent discussion about anything, because the press has deteriorated to the point where they can't ask a coherent follow-up question to any of these people. All they can talk about is politics because it doesn't require any knowledge. We're all political experts.
Jim Hoge, you remember the good old days when you really were a journalist? Let me go to something far less controversial. Far less. Just to cool the room. Let's talk about terrorism.
I thought that's what I was talking about.
Judith, I think you've written that it's not gone, it's not passé, it's with us, it'll stay with us. You think so?
I think it's very much with us. Even though Susan Rice said that what had happened in Benghazi was all about a protest, for which she has not apologized, and a statement she made without any qualifiers at all, such as, according to the best knowledge we have at this point in time. Nothing like that, because she does want to be Secretary of State, and somebody had to carry that ridiculous message to the American people. Yes, I mean, we have seen now 4 Americans dead in Benghazi, and we're going to not know until, I think, Tom Pickering issues his report precisely who was to blame and why. But the notion that we can declare victory in a war that Obama never wanted to wage against terrorism, but has wound up waging with a ferocity that has astonished the left wing of his party, is one of those great paradoxes of the Obama presidency. And this is a man who has no problem killing, none whatsoever. You just ask the Pakistani family whose house was blown away, or ask the Pakistani young man who is automatically defined as a terrorist suspect simply because of his age and where he happens to be. Now, I happen to approve of the use of drones rather than seeing more Americans sent over there to be killed. But this comes with a price and a cost and a certain hypocrisy. And I think that if I'm disappointed by Obama, it's that he has been waging a war that he is embarrassed to talk about, and that we're going to have to go on waging for a good long time if we want to remain safe in New York and Los Angeles and our other cities. Because I know this enemy. He is not going to go away. As they say of the Taliban, you have the watches, we have the time. We're seeing that play out in Afghanistan. Now we're seeing Mali being taken over by the same people. Mali, to me, reminds me of Afghanistan without the mountains. Okay? A country where everybody says it's so far away, what does it matter? Who cares? Why should we get involved? We should get involved because in today's age, as we learned on September 11th, people travel. And they find ways to get you. And while you can't get hysterical about terrorism, you can't forget about it either or declare that it's over.
I would say, by the way, that I think Afghanistan with the mountains is probably Yemen. I mean, the way, I don't find Mali as frightening because it doesn't have mountains. And mountains are terribly important in terms of terrorism because they give people places to hide. Iraq was a place that didn't have mountains, and it was actually turned out to be a lot easier on the military side because it's flat ground.
Osama bin Laden consolidated his forces in Sudan before he ever made all of the arrangements he needed to make before he got
nobody was attacking
to Afghanistan.
All I mean is nobody was attacking
all
at
I'm
the time,
saying
right?
is that it's not going to go away, and I think sometimes the Obama people pretend as if it is, at the same time that they've done more than anyone ever thought they were going to do
Well, the irony, I think, of the pivot to Asia is that the idea of the
pivot
pivot to Asia.
Where is it? We're not going anywhere. We're going to be in the Middle East. We have 70,000 troops in Afghanistan.
I think that's
We're
right.
gonna stay.
And that's the fantasy is that we can leave behind this ugly world of terrorism, but it's going to follow us.
Exactly.
And so while we're pivoting to Asia, we're suddenly going to be sending special operations forces to Mali and Yemen and so forth. So it's a little bit of a dream.
Where is it written that the United States must be the country that does all of this?
Amen.
Right?
Amen.
I mean, seriously. I mean, and this is not just a point for the masses, though. Thank you. But
calling them the masses?
When I think about what the Europeans don't do in the Middle East and Africa and Afghanistan, what the Russians don't do, what the Chinese don't do, the ability for the United States to do radically less than they are presently doing, spend radically less, is dramatic. Let's not fool ourselves on this issue. And that is probably coming because it's hard to make the argument that the U.S. should stay in Afghanistan beyond 2014.
Who's making the argument we should stay in Afghanistan? Neither candidate is making that argument.
No,
for re-election.
but your point was that the level of engagement the U.S. is going to have in the Middle East
I didn't say we have to be
going.
engaged with American forces. I said there are many different ways to be engaged, but remaining engaged is essential, and we will be.
You see a difference between the two, Ian?
I do. I see between the two arguments or the two candidates.
Oh, I'll pick the candidate.
Actually, I see less of a difference between the two candidates. I think that if you look at substance of Romney versus Obama on Iran, or on Syria, or on China, it's actually very, very small. And certainly if the neocons take over in Romney land, life will be a little different, but they'll be still radically constrained by popular opinion and by Romney. We should mention Susan Rice, because there are very smart people in Washington that actually do believe, and I'll echo a little bit of what Judith was saying here, that she's not up for that job. And if she gets it, that's important, because she is, many believe, to be the front runner at this point.
Although Wes has given it to Kerry.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Kerry certainly is the, if you ask the people sitting up here who they think is the best choice for the job, given that I think without any question, Hillary Clinton has been the highest performing of Obama's cabinet, irrespective of whether you like Obama or Romney, I think we say Kerry. He's he's basically the wonk's choice. That doesn't mean he's going to get the job. But if you ask me where we're going to go down on policy, I think both of these candidates. Yeah, it's true. Romney went to Israel. He had to. $25 million required it. But, right, and I certainly think that he'd tack more towards the Saudis because, again, the CEO connections, the oil connections are going to be closer there. But I think even under Romney, the level of comparative disengagement from the Middle East, and including from Israel, if you put in the context of where we've been over the last 5, 10, 20, 30 years, that trajectory is changing.
Do you think there's any difference, Romney, Obama, regarding Iran?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, a big difference, I think.
Here.
Big difference.
Let's take this somewhat technical issue of is our red line when they have nuclear weapons, or is it when they have capabilities? Obama is on weapons, which gives him a longer timeline to try and get a solution some other way. Romney has clearly stated that he is, along with the Netanyahu government, he is committed to stopping Iran from ever having the capability of producing nuclear weapons. So I think this is a very big difference.
Jim? Yeah, I think Romney's committed to whatever Netanyahu says. I mean, that's his position, basically, and I think that's the Republican. I mean, I find it shocking that the Republicans used to say the Democrats are subcontracting American foreign policy to Kofi Annan. That was a Bob Dole claim in 1996. It seems to me the Republicans have quite openly decided to subcontract portions of Middle East policy, and certainly Iran policy, to Israel. And I think that's a terrible mistake, and I say that with all regard for Israel. We shouldn't be subcontracting our policy to anyone. So I don't know where Romney would go, but I know he would go where Netanyahu says he should go.
Well, you've just agitated Judith.
Yeah,
again.
the interesting conversations I've been having with my Israeli friends are, despite the great friendship between Romney and Bibi, a lot of Israelis that I know who follow Iran the closest think that a military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities is more likely in a second Obama term than a first Romney term. That's the way they see the man.
Why is that?
Because Romney would be very focused on the American economy and restoring growth, and doesn't want a foreign intervention that would be as high risk, high stakes as that one. On the other hand, Obama is a man who is very committed to non-proliferation. He does not want to be the American president who presides over the de facto collapse of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
I study this all the time. I haven't got the foggiest idea what either of these guys would do. Their rhetoric has not been too much different from one another. It just hasn't. It is such small nuance that you can't tell. During a campaign, neither one of these guys wants to look weak toward Iran. So they've walked themselves rhetorically right up to the point of saying that if Iran does anything to cross the line from a capability to an actual nuclear weapon, we're committed to act. Do I believe that either of them would do that? I don't know. They wouldn't get much support from the U.S. military. They wouldn't get support from the Israeli military or the Israeli intelligence. So I think when push comes to shove, presidents, even if they're inclined to act to show that they're tough, to deal with non-proliferation, are going to find it very difficult to gather any support for it.
Iran's currency is collapsing. The sanctions are significant. There has been very significant sabotage against Iranian centrifuges. There have been efforts and successful assassinations against folks in Iran that are engaged in the ballistic missile program, as well as the general nuclear program. There have been cyber attacks. The U.S. and the Israelis have engaged in that together under an Obama administration. They would engage in that together under a Romney administration. Overwhelmingly, that's the important piece of this. The reason Netanyahu, 95% in my view of why Netanyahu says this is an existential threat to Israel is because if he doesn't keep saying that, we will lose focus. And more importantly, other countries will lose focus. It's important for Netanyahu to continue to do this, but not so far that he's caught crying wolf. And I think he's been an effective advocate of Israeli national policy.
Ian, what you've just described is a policy of containment. And that takes time. And that's one of the dilemmas we have here. Both these guys have signed off from containment, and so they don't have the time to let these things take effect. Sanctions take years to bring a government down. It doesn't happen overnight. And the rest of it, the same. Now, Iran looks very much like a country which is going to implode, just as the Soviet Union did. But it's probably not going to be tomorrow. It's still a high-energy regime that's quite capable of suppressing people who'd like to overthrow them. It won't stay that way, but it might take 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. We don't know. You can't run a policy like that unless you sign on the containment rather than prevention.
I'm not suggesting the policy is ultimately going to work.
No,
I'm suggesting that the policy for both administrations is actually pretty damn straightforward. And on the bits that if it doesn't work, I think like Les, I don't think they've come to a decision point.
You know, I don't see why we're going crazy about Iran anyway. I don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. But by the same token, I think the most dangerous country in the world is Pakistan. And I think the next most dangerous is North Korea. And we don't jump up and down like idiots about those two countries.
I think we do have to think about Iran because I think the region is becoming increasingly unstable. We had a strategy that we could get at Iran through the soft underbelly of Syria. So we've been pushing to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, thinking that that would establish democracy, and then therefore that would push the Iranians back and reduce their support. And what we've done is we've provoked greater Iranian intervention in the region, and we've provoked greater Iranian influence in the government of Iraq. So even though we don't know whether either candidate would strike or not, and even though we're talking about it as though it's a rational decision, and even though we're thinking that this is really about Iranian nuclear weapons, none of those three might be true. Because if this roiling instability continues in Syria, if the Iranians hit the next target, which is Jordan, if Lebanon collapses, then the view from Israel is going to look profoundly different. And then wars happen when people are put in situations where they seem to have no alternative. And if Iran is effective in putting the noose around Israel, then have to believe that other actions will follow from that, regardless of the nuclear status.
But Wes, the Israelis can't decide who they're for, Assad or the rebels. It's a pox on both their houses as far as the Israelis are concerned.
No, but what is happening is the Iranians are coming in.
They're already in.
They're coming in greater strength.
But I think there's also, I mean, I think Wes is right in saying that there's a good reason to be preoccupied with Iran even outside of the question of nuclear weapons. And it is hardly unimaginable that this Arab world in tumult could come to look more and more like a giant, diversified, ramified Sunni Shia battle. And God knows that's how Saudi Arabia thinks it's going to wind up. That obviously doesn't mean that's right. But certainly Iran, unlike Pakistan, Pakistan is a mess. It's just a hopelessly incoherent country which can barely control its own enormous energies. Iran is still a revolutionary regime. And that's quite an unusual thing in the world. And it's a revolutionary regime in a really big country which is really centrally located. And so Iran's wish and ability to do mischief quite outside of its nuclear power, and perhaps all they really want is the ability to scare the hell out of people with their nuclear capacity, makes them a dangerous country, especially at this moment with the Middle East in turmoil. It's another reason why, alas, we're not going to have much of a pivot to Asia, because this is going to be a profoundly preoccupying issue.
But Jim, who's done more damage to U.S. interests in, I would say, world security? Iran or Pakistan by selling nuclear secrets, nuclear technology, nuclear material?
Well,
they've already harmed us more than anything Iran would do.
Yeah.
And what would you do about Iran differently than what Obama has been doing?
Well, I wouldn't. But what I'm saying is that, no, I mean, I think that Obama's policy in Iran is correct, and I think you're quite right in saying there's not that much difference between what, especially on Iran. I don't think that Romney's going to be able to do that much that's very different. It's just a problem. And as Jim said, it perhaps ought to be thought of as being like the Soviet Union, but, well, I don't know if it's too late or not. You know, Obama has said no to containment. And I think Obama politically had to say no to containment. The Israelis fear that he didn't mean it. I hope he didn't mean it. I fear he did mean it. I mean, I think in the end, containment, I hope that they implode that way. But I think
he may get caught up in having said it,
maybe.
Even when he doesn't want to be.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I mean,
you guys sound like an Abbott and Costello routine. I'm not quite clear who was saying what. I love Les's reference to Pakistan, just to be autobiographical. I happen to be a great lover of a country called India. And it seems to me that the Pakistan-India nexus potentially motivates the Pakistani and the Indian policies in a way that may transcend concern about Iran. Or am I just an old fogey? Have I been watching Gandhi too often?
No, I think that's true, except that, but there are some shifts that I think are quite important the way they're going. India is becoming a major world power, and it knows it. It may take longer than they know, but that's the path they're on. And it's the path that's in their head. And that means that their idea about Pakistan, which used to be that Pakistan was a failed state and a dangerous state that had to be dealt with and was an equal sort of combatant to India. Now they look at Pakistan more as being a problem that they'd like to have off their back. They can't settle on Kashmir for a bunch of reasons, but they really don't want to have this face-to-face, potentially combative situation to continue. It's getting in the way of their rise.
Yeah, thank God Indians aren't as obsessed with Pakistan as Pakistanis are
Exactly.
with Indians.
Right. Pakistanis are obsessed
Totally.
with
Right.
India.
Totally.
And the more they're written off as not significant, the crazier they get. So I don't find it comforting.
Right.
I don't find that comforting at all.
But before we go and let our friends throw rocks at you, it's interesting to me that nobody's mentioned Europe. I mean,
Nice place for a
do we
vacation.
care about Europe anymore?
Well, I think the funny thing about Europe is that the United States is still, we have the money to do everything. We've got embassies all over the world. If you listen to a State of the Union address, who knows what the priorities are, because absolutely everything is discussed. Our special relationship, of course, in Europe is still with Britain. And Romney, when he traveled, yeah, he went to Israel, he went to Poland, which would be a part of the G21, and he went to Britain. And the fact is that China is constrained. China only has so much time. They only have so much money. They only have so many diplomats. When they go to Europe, they do one thing. They do Germany. The ability of the United States to actually focus in a changed way in how European leadership has been changing is not there. We do not move our agenda, our capacity to do foreign policy quickly enough to react to a world that is changing very dramatically, and that's probably more true and more obvious in Europe than anywhere else in the world right now.
I think Europe matters because if you're going to deal effectively with China, you need to be doing it in concert with Europe. Unfortunately, we're not. That's a failure of strategic vision.
And Europe is deteriorating at some level. And what will the next administration do about a possible continuation of that deterioration?
I think Europe has to get past the idea of austerity. And once they get past this idea, Europe's going to be just fine. There's a lot of hydrocarbon resources in Europe, and shale's coming to Europe just like it is in North Dakota. And when it comes, it'll change the energy equation, and it'll change some of the economics, even in countries like Spain. So it's a matter of struggling through this, the European Central Bank and their own fixation on austerity and putting in place policies that will let Europe grow again.
Wes, you've made my evenings. I was fearing for my wine supply. Let's go to the audience. Do we have microphones out there wandering around? People want to say things. Who's got the mics? Down here.
We didn't have any good discussion about Europe.
There's a lot of conversation about Iran, but nobody mentioned the fact that there's an election next year and what effect that might have in terms of changing the whole political structure.
Yeah, but it might make it worse.
Repeat the question. Repeat the question.
What effect might the election in Iran next year have on the political situation there and our attitude toward what's going on?
Well, just to say one quick thing, it's clear that Ahmadinejad has now been well and truly slapped down by the clerics who run Iran. So Khamenei has been, the Ayatollah has been consolidating his control. Ahmadinejad will not be allowed to run again. It's not really clear what his post-presidential job will be. And so if anything, the kind of fragmentation which we've seen in Iran may actually diminish as a result of the election, because I suspect that there are not going to be so many competing centers of power as there are now.
Before we saw the real impact of sanctions the nuclear program was very popular across wide swaths of the Iranian electorate, even including the liberal protesters, including Mousavi, the liberal candidate against Ahmadinejad. So I'd be interested now in seeing the polls in Iran, I mean, as accurate as we can get them, to see what the support for the nuclear program would be now post-sanctions, given the drop in the value of the rial and sort of the sense of isolation that the Persian state is under now.
If I can just add one quick point on Iran, it's that, yes, there's a lot of discussion about nuclear, whether Iran should have nuclear or not, but the Iranians' electric generation, or their demand for electricity is among the fastest growing on the planet. So from the Iranian point of view, having a reactor makes business sense to them because they are, despite massive natural gas and oil resources, they are a natural gas importer and have been for a long time. They are electricity generation short and in a big way. And so the question, and if you look at it, in my view, from the Iranians' point of view, they're saying we need electric power. And what's happening in other countries in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis are all looking at adding their own reactors. So
that's part of it, but the nuclear issue in Iran is also an issue of nationalism and populism. And the the evidence I've seen suggests that it's just as popular today across the spectrum of the population as it has ever been. I'm not sure that the election next year is going to consolidate things. Factionalism is becoming a very big thing within Iran, and I believe that the forces that are bringing it about, which are essentially the problems in the economy as well as in their international relations, are just going to make the factions even more pronounced than they are now. For example, the old line traders under Rafsanjani are coming back. There's the Guard, the Revolutionary Guard, which has become an independent force in Iranian life and Iranian politics. I think if you look past the election, the chances are it's going to be a more fractious place, a less productive place, and a more dangerous place.
They had a green revolution. Given the economic hardships, clearly there's going to be a lot of instability. There's a reason why the Iranians are working right now with the Chinese and Huawei to try to segregate their internet as fast as humanly possible from the World Wide Web. Probably not going to be fast enough to be effective before the 2014 elections, but that is something that we have serious issues with, and you would expect a lot of instability in Iran with those elections.
Other questions? Microphone? Microphone.
As far as Iran is concerned, I believe they import gasoline, so go figure. I want to ask a question about how the countries of the world view the two candidates. I live in France, and I lived through 8 years of dinner parties where the word George Bush was enough to turn people into real animals. And that may be right or wrong. Then Obama came along, and it was a love fest, the likes of which you can't even imagine. What would people in the world that you all know think about Romney, as far as you can gather?
You refuse to answer that question when I ask.
Well, Europeans still love Obama. That is clear. So, and our orientation is so much towards Europe when we're answering the question you just asked. It's not universal. I mean, Eastern Europeans don't like him as much, so maybe they'd like Romney more. I don't know. But I mean, generally, you know, the world prefers it when America has somebody like Obama.
Not necessarily the Middle East, however. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, go ahead.
But the Pew poll that's been done has shown that the America, whether or not, despite its leaders, remains just as unpopular in the Middle East as we were under George Bush. There has been no movement whatsoever in that figure.
At least in Europe. I was in France just a couple months ago, and I was talking to a German in France who had never even heard of Romney. So I think right now, I think the momentum is simply just Obama's going to win this. At least they're hoping for that to be the case. But I would agree with Judith on this point in terms of our popularity in the Middle East. You know, I think it's also because of the expectations that were placed on Obama. And what Obama actually sort of, you know, he said he was going to transcend the political discourse in Washington, that he was going to really change America. He was going to try and close down Guantanamo Bay. He didn't. But he did ban enhanced interrogation techniques. He did close CIA black sites. So in terms of the policies and the substance of his policies, there's a bit of disconnect. And of course, drones have incredibly harmed his reputation in the Muslim world. We can't ignore that. And that's also part of the problem that we've seen within Pakistan, at least in terms of the increased radicalism and extremism that have been sort of pouring from the tribal areas into the major cities, into Karachi, into Islamabad, into Rawalpindi. So I think overall, you know, I think it depends on the continent when we're talking about Obama's popularity versus Romney's, or if people have even heard of Romney.
Europe would see it.
No, the world.
The world.
The world that you know, whatever part of the world you know best.
Well, in Europe, remember what the European response was from Reagan when he was first elected. He was elected a cowboy, a movie star, and then they changed their mind after a while in both pro and con.
20 years.
I think the problem Romney is going to have is that what he represents, if he continues the rhetoric of the campaign, is an America that Europe does not like, which is overly imperial on its own. And only if Reagan was able, if Romney was able to become a different president than is suggested by his campaign, I don't think he's going to be cutting to very much over there.
In fact, yeah, there was a piece in the Times last week about how Romney's advisors are sort of bringing up this argument about possibly bringing back enhanced interrogation techniques. And, you know, he hasn't really backed away from the rhetoric of preventive war. He hasn't backed away or repudiated the Iraq war. So I can imagine that if he's going to bring back a lot of the Bush-era policies, that Romney's popularity would probably plummet, or at least America's reputation would plummet around the world.
Microphone. Let's get somebody way in the back there.
Hello? I wonder if the panel could resolve, I hear two separate opinions about Hillary Clinton and her role in foreign policy. First, that she's been incredibly effective as a member of the cabinet, and secondly, that she really hasn't played a very big role in American foreign policy over the past 4 years. So I'd just be curious to hear you resolve that and maybe assess her compared to her predecessors, and hear where you think she may be headed from here.
I'll take the pro because I think I made that point. She's been to over 100 countries so far, and her ability to be a great interlocutor and communicator everywhere she touches has been very effective indeed. So if you want to talk about folks around the world that generally like the Obama administration, I think Hillary Clinton has probably done more to affect those pew polls in many of these countries than anyone else in the Obama administration has. That's important. On the pivot towards Asia, that was largely determined by Obama himself. On economic statecraft, that was bottom up, that was Hillary. She put that speech together last October, basically from whole cloth. That's half of the actual doctrine, if you're buying, sort of my general perspective here. She's definitely been a team player, and she's definitely been able to marshal lots of different perspectives from across the administration. She's also reasonably well respected on foreign policy issues in Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on Republicans and Democrats. I think that matters. So is she a person who is driving foreign policy in the way that Kissinger used to, for example? No, not across the board. I wouldn't say that. I think Obama takes a lot of his own counsel, particularly when things get really dicey or important decision points. But has she been a very effective Secretary of State compared to many other secretaries, many of whom we can't name in this administration? The answer from my perspective is absolutely yes.
Anyone want to take the unpopular opposite position?
Well, yeah, no, I would just say, no, but I don't think that there's a contradiction. That is, Hillary has been a tremendously effective Secretary of State, but she is not, and I think she has said so, she is not a core decision maker in this administration. Is she more important than Dennis McDonough, who's the #2 guy in the National Security Council? Probably not. If you're trying to figure out who is more influential in determining policy in Afghanistan, Iran, places like that, I don't think so. But as the public face of America in the world, as the master of American diplomacy, as all the things Ian said she was, I think she's been enormously effective.
Of Jim, I think we need to put it in some historical context, which is that starting with the Cold War, the policy making of the United States and the world has moved piece by piece into the White House. And look at the staffing. The staffing now in the White House, at the NSC and the White House itself, is enormous. It used to be 3 or 4 people. So Hillary is not out of line in that she is not a core policymaker. But there are several aspects to the Secretary of State's job that she has been superb at. One is representing the country. The other one is in negotiations or getting tough with folks. I think she's listened to. I think she's an advisor to policy. But no, she is not a key policymaker in the sense that Secretary of State might have been once earlier in American history, like Seward to Lincoln.
I'd
or
like to point out
Kissinger?
one really extraordinary achievement of the State Department and Hillary, and that is what's happened to Iran under sanctions. And it's no small feat that Iran, which was exporting 2.2 million barrels a day last winter, was exporting 670,000 barrels a day this summer, and to orchestrate the collaboration of that many countries around the world and to have put that stranglehold on Iran is wholly a result of the State Department under her leadership.
Hands, hands, hands. Where's the mic? Where's the mic? There's the mic over there.
Thanks, everyone. I think there are two issues that we've overlooked a little bit, and both are kind of compatible because they're both very cutting edge and both raise a lot of important strategic, tactical, and moral questions. And those issues are the use of cyber warfare and the use of drones. And I think actually I'd recommend to all of you a report that one of our centers at the law school just released about the use of drones and the troubling questions it raises about the killing of civilians in Pakistan. My question is, what are the prospects of the next 4 years, particularly under an Obama second term, let's assume, for addressing both the use of cyber warfare and the use of drones, and whether we might see something like a nuclear non-proliferation treaty for cyber warfare and the use of drones to regulate those in warfare? Thank you.
It was only until recently that the Obama administration, it was only until recently that the Obama administration even publicly admitted that there was a program, this Title 50 operation program of the use of drones. So I think the Obama administration, if it will be reelected, is going to be very reluctant to articulate a coherent policy. That said, I mean, I would say that, you know, drones are the lesser of two evils if we're talking about, you know, surgical operations versus boots on the ground. But that said, it has it lulls us into tranquility in the sense that we can begin to use drones more often. And I think we're going to be attacking more countries and using increased use of drones. And I think, honestly, it's just economics 101. If you decrease the cost, you increase demand. And so I can imagine under President Romney or under President Obama, the expanded use of drones. And now we're bringing drones to the homeland, in fact, for surveillance, for domestic surveillance. Even in areas where police officers would not normally use drones or where surveillance would be used, would be very difficult to come by. So I think overall, I don't think the administration is going to be publicly articulating a very coherent vision in terms of restraining its own powers. I think it's unfortunate. I'm one of the few people, at least in Washington, who wants to limit the size of government and its scope and its power over our lives. But I can't imagine that the executive branch would begin imposing more restraints on itself, especially when it comes to drones, unfortunately.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll come in on this one. I think it's really unfortunate that the information on the cyber attacks came out publicly. We've had these capabilities for a long time. We've thought about them. We've recognized our own vulnerabilities as a nation to them. And we knew that when we used it, there was a risk that it would be discovered and what the consequences would be. So it's out in the open. Lots of nations using it. There's some amazing documentation that's come out on China's use now of cyber reconnaissance and how they rip apart business enterprises and take key data and how it's fed back into the Chinese system. Pretty remarkable when you see this. It looks to me like it's a system that's only going to be controlled when there's no alternative. Because right now, we're still looking at ways of using cyber offensively. We're looking at ways of strengthening our defenses. And it's so mixed up in commerce that it's really difficult for anyone to conceive that you're going to get 5 powers around the table and negotiate a treaty that's going to take this out of play. I think it's in play. I think it's just a fact of life.
I'd also add that one of the major reasons that we'll see virtually no Chinese direct investment in the United States is precisely because of the Chinese use of their facilities and direct investments to wage cyber warfare.
Very analogous to what the Chinese have done in the intellectual property field. It's more blessed to receive than to give. All right, 1 or 2 more. Where's the mic? Get him, and then we'll go in the middle.
I just wanted to probe one more time about the role of Secretary Clinton in foreign policy. And it has to do with Libya. The New York Times and many of the news organizations in the United States did an expose in terms of the lead in terms of the United States involvement in Libya. And it was very clear from the accounts that it was Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Bryce on one side who were very much vocal in supporting our intervention in Libya. And on the other side, you had the defense chief at the Pentagon who were very reluctant to go into that conflict. And so to me, I find it very ironic that the one area where the President of the United States is being found fault with in terms of its foreign policy is this conflict in which he had to almost be pushed very severely into a conflict that he did not want to go into. So with that as background, do you still take the position, given the very strong influence going into Libya that, again, quoting the New York Times reports, that the State Department played in getting into Libya? I was just wondering if you would take that into consideration into your critique that she didn't have much influence.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
I think that's probably the single best example of a place where she did have specific influence. And it's quite specific, which is to say, at that time when the decision was being made, Hillary was in Europe, I believe in Munich, and she was speaking to Middle East allies. And the question that she had to be able to answer was, would Middle East allies, which I think in this case probably meant Qatar, UAE, Saudi, support and be part of a coalition to attack Libya? And it was only when she was able to say the answer to that is yes, and then Susan Rice in New York was able to say, and we can get a majority in the, we can get at least 9 votes in the Security Council and will not have, I think, a veto. Only then was Obama willing to say, okay. So yes, I think Hillary was both an advocate and a very important enabler.
But America was not in the lead, and let's remember that, right? Go back to when all of this was going on. It's kind of the exception that proves the rule. The Arab League was begging the U.S. to take action. We haven't heard from the Arab League in decades, right? The Gulf Cooperation Council was begging the Americans. Sarkozy was, allons-y, let's go in, right? The French were ready to go in before the Americans. The Brits were ready to go in. And furthermore, Gaddafi was hated by everyone. He might have been the one leader that the Iranians and the Saudis actually agree on in all the Middle East, right? He had no natural allies. He had folks he was paying off that were basically mercenaries from around Africa. And only after all that did the United States say, yes, we'll do this under the following conditions. Clinton did push to make that happen. But let's just put it in context.
All right. Last question. Where's the mic?
Yes. The word exceptionalism came up in the panel. And America has given the world such domains as nuclear weapons. They used it first. Now drones and cyber warfare. Now it's one thing for politicians to talk about what we should be able to do. So, for example, use drones to save American lives so we don't have to send soldiers. But I'm surprised that a panel would talk about America as if they're so special that they should be allowed to use things, because we know that every time America does those things, it goes from America to every other country around the world. So I'm just wondering whether people on the panel are concerned about their own taking on exceptionalism within themselves.
All right, look into your hearts and souls. Yeah. What do you have to say for yourselves, you 9 guilty people?
I'm sorry. I'm an unabashed American exceptionalist because I think I've seen a lot of the good that America has done and a lot of the chaos that occurs when we won't get involved. I think that in Libya, and this is really relating to the last question, something that the Clintons were very affected by was the failure to take action in Rwanda. And when Gaddafi was threatening to wipe out his people like rats, this resonated for them. They remembered what it was like not to have an America that says, we have a responsibility to protect. That doesn't mean we don't make terrible mistakes, but on balance, I would ask you if you can find a country that's been as powerful as we've been for as long as we've been, that has, I think, a pretty decent record. So, yeah, the last time I checked, everybody is still trying to come here, or Canada. But, you know, but I don't apologize, and I don't feel guilty for thinking that American intervention overall oftentimes leads to a better world.
I think you make an excellent point, and I would agree. I think that for many people, especially for someone like the Mitt Romney campaign, those on the folks on the Mitt Romney campaign, they don't understand the contradiction in their own arguments when it comes to American exceptionalism. What they say and what it actually conveys to many people around the world is because we are morally superior, it just justifies us committing immoral acts. And I think when we convey that impression, we actually diminish our values and diminish our principles, and we undermine our long-term strategy and our long-term economic future with many countries around the world.
I would agree with Judy, but with a twist. I would say I don't think any country in history has done as much good in the world as we have. Our problem comes when we try to do too much good.
All right, in the Shakespearean sense, the senior member of the panel, still alive, speaks last, and that's Les. My thanks to these wonderful 9 people.